She's just helpfully instructed me to lower the microphones. Thanks, Steph. Thank you. Advice from the tall people. Thank you very much for having me here today, and it's a pleasure to be amongst so many of the football luminati in Victoria. A special shout out to Bridie, who've started with the Victorian government, and I think the Vic government has really led the way in women in sport, so all credit to you and all the best with your role. We look forward to being a big part of it. As you might know, I've had some adventures in the international side of football over the last several years. When Australia joined Asia in 2006, I joined the board of FFA shortly afterwards. Asia created quota positions for women back then, and I got a tap on the shoulder and I got put on a plane, and I actually had no idea what I was in for. But as it turned out, I have been involved with the AFC Executive Committee and the women's football in Asia, and also spent 3 years on the FIFA Executive Committee during a pretty interesting period, as well as being part of its Women's Football Committee, organising the World Cup and leading the Women's Football Task Force, which played a role in the reforms. So I thought today I would share with you some of the things that I observed on that adventure, how I tried to make a difference, what actually happened, and then bring back some reflections on the challenges that we face in the game now in that context, and some reflections on leadership, because I think today is also about leadership. So we're part of a world game, and the world comprises a lot of diversity. And the situation for women in football is similarly diverse. For example, if you were in Iran, you would not be allowed to attend a stadium to watch a men's football match, because apparently the men don't behave very well when they're at football matches, and the solution is just to ban the women. In many parts of the world, large parts of the world, maybe even all of it, there's a strong degree of son preference. So that means that you'd rather have a boy than have a girl. So it starts even before you're born, that actually you're a disappointment. And when it comes to getting educated or getting leisure time, boys tend to be preferred ahead of girls. So if you're running a women's or girls' football program in one of these countries, the first problem you'll face is that the girls aren't given time to play in the way that their brothers are. In fact, they're not given education in the way that their brothers are either. And there's one Southeast Asian country that an NGO was running a football program. One of the girls sort of disappeared from the program, and they inquired as to why, and they learned that she'd been sold to a neighbouring country she'd been trafficked, basically, by her family in order to pay for her brother's education. And that's not that unusual. It's shocking to us. I can't imagine selling my daughter to pay for my son's education, and yet that is part of the sort of regime of son preference that prevails in many parts of the world. I've actually met a woman from Cambodia who escaped from having been trafficked as a 13 or 14-year-old, and she's now 24, and she's a coach in Cambodia, and she came to a coach instructors program that we held in Shanghai a few months ago. So she is going to teach other coaches, other women, to be coaches. It's an extraordinary story, but you know, when you hear and you meet some of these people, you realise what a long and lonely struggle it can be just to play the game, and yet the passion for the game and the rewards of playing the game are so great that people are prepared to go through almost anything to be part of it. And yet still, in about half of the member associations around the world, and there's 211 members in FIFA, so about half of those, there is no grassroots program for girls. So that's 6 to 12-year-olds, no grassroots program run by the official federations in just over half of the countries in the world. At the other end of the spectrum, we're seeing enormous success and growth, and you know, heartwarming crowd sizes and audience sizes for the women's game. Sometimes in surprising places. For example, in Venezuela last year, they were hosting the Under-16 South American Championships. So the winners of that would go off to Jordan for the Under-17 World Cup. And Venezuela is a country with a lot of challenges. political, economic, just about everything actually. And their youth team did very well. They made it to the final, and they had a crowd of, I think it was 43,000 people who came to watch their junior women's national team play the final against Brazil, and they beat them 1-0. So I'm looking at Ray Dower and thinking, what would it take to get 43,000 Australians out to watch the under-16 junior Matildas? And yet it happened in Venezuela. In Africa, the women's final was between Nigeria and Cameroon. It was held in Cameroon, and they had I think a 40,000 capacity crowd, and the ground was full 5 hours before kick-off. They had to close the gates, and everybody just sang and enjoyed the day until kick-off occurred. So these things are not random events anymore. I mean, sure, we see them at the Olympics, we see them at the World Cup, but we're actually seeing them in some interesting places in the world, and they're not isolated events. You know, this is part of a pattern. At the Euros, of course, which is probably the most developed confederation competition, that was held in Holland in August. And there were a lot of travelling fans. That was probably the most interesting thing, was that Europe's pretty small compared to, you know, like us, but there were lots of travelling fans from Denmark, from France, from Germany, from all over, and that was the first time I'd seen them in such numbers coming out at an international competition. And in Holland, of course, we saw the success of the home team, which was very interesting because that's the first generation of players in their system who have had the benefits of their policies on mixed gender football when they're kids, moving into talent programs as they get older. And they also had a woman coach who's a former player on their national team, one of just a handful of women coaches who appear at the highest levels of competition. Also interesting, though, is how successful they are when they do compete at that highest level. And if you look at all of the Olympic tournaments since 2000, you look at all of the World Cups since 2000, and you look at all of the Euros since 2000, you'll find that actually 12 of those 13 competitions, if you add them all up, were won by female coach teams. So it's actually extraordinary, the success that they achieve, notwithstanding that they're underrepresented at virtually every level of the game on the way through. So within those vast variations of circumstance in countries around the world, I see some common themes that come through. And these probably won't surprise you all that much, but essentially women are vastly underrepresented at every level of the game, in almost every aspect of the game. Women's football is generally not the top priority of whatever organisation is running the game. So it's a little bit like you've got, I'm not a gardener, but like, you know, a great big tree, and it's getting all the sunshine and all the water, it's kind of sucking up all the nutrients out of the earth, and then you plant a little tree kind of right next to it, and you wonder why it doesn't grow very much. Well, you know, it needs sunshine and water. And the teams who are successful in women's football are those who try. They make a consistent effort, and a team like Venezuela, with their under-17 national team, has been in the last 4 of the last 2 Junior World Cups at that level, because they made a consistent effort. They're not a wealthy country, they're a football-crazy country, but, you know, some of those players, I mean, one of them I met in Jordan, she was an orphan, I think. They'd found the father's body out the front of the house. He'd been shot when she was about 7 or 8. She lived with her grandparents in a house that was no bigger than your living room. And here she was at an under-17 World Cup, having a crack at football on the world stage. And hopefully the game will open opportunities for her that she would never have received otherwise. But once again, a consistent effort is everything, whether it's at a club or a national level. Also, amongst the common themes, women tend to have very little role in decision-making. It's sort of a curious phenomenon, but I guess it's because we didn't play for a long time. So when women's football was banned in England in 1921, and all of those post-World War I enthusiastic players had to kind of go back home or find an unofficial competition to play in, the legacy of those bans lasted for decades. Actually, England didn't legitimise women's football at the FA until the 70s. So it was 50 years of being locked out of the system. We inherited a lot of that, of course, in Australia, but it wasn't only England, it was also Brazil, Germany, many other countries did this. And that, because we weren't playing, I guess, it reduced our equity in every other part of the game, in all off-field roles. So the situation today is that if you look globally, I think 2 out of 211 presidents of football organisations globally are female. That's less than 1%. And women tend to have very little role in decision-making, including about women's football. Resourcing tends to be disproportionately small. Most federations would spend single-digit percentage of their budget on women's football. And that would be mirrored throughout state and regional bodies and clubs, I suspect. Not universally, and it is changing, but overall the picture is of disproportionately low resourcing. And of course, disproportionately low media exposure as well. That's a legacy of the bans. But what I find interesting is you can look at photographs from 1920 in England, right? 1920. And you'll see tens of thousands of people in the crowd watching club football, right? So if anybody tells you that people aren't interested in watching women's sport, that they never have been, that, you know, this is just how it is, well, you know, they're wrong. It's not like it's a natural order of things that people should be disinterested in watching women play sport. It's the result of decades and decades of conditioning where we've all grown up in a world where we haven't, you know, when I was a kid, I didn't see women's team sports on TV. I can barely remember any female athletes who were Australian. 2 or 3, that's all. Right? Now, that will change generation upon generation, but don't let anybody tell you that people don't want to watch women's sport. It's just not true. We knew it in 1920, and it's, and you know, in some ways, when I sat in that crowd in Sydney watching the Brazil games, and when I sit in the crowd tonight, I'll be thinking it's taken 100 years to get back to where things were in 1920. And yet, at the same time, while we're disproportionately underrepresented in pretty much all parts of football, in the business world, it's very clear that diverse groups make better decisions. And any number of studies will tell you this. One of my favourites is about share price. I think Credit Suisse did this, this study, and they found that the share price, when normalised for all other things, is 26% higher if you have at least one woman on a board, on a company board, compared to no women. I mean, it's an extraordinary statistic, and you kind of think, so why isn't this happening? Who doesn't want a 26% uplift in their share price, right? And they do the same studies on EBIT, on profitability, on all sorts of things. And it's consistently true that diverse groups, not only gender diversity, but all kinds of diversity, diverse groups arrive at better decisions. And that's good for corporations, and I'm sure it will be good in sport. I'll just run you through quickly what happened to me at FIFA and how I tried to make a difference. You might know that I got there as a quota, so I was always a quota position. If you want to know what a quota looks like, it's me. I was one of 3 women who were brought into the FIFA Exco out of 27 in total, 27 people, and that was after 108 years of all-male decision-making at the top table of FIFA. And there were many adventures, but I'll focus on what happened during the reform period in FIFA, because you might recall that 2015 was a very interesting year of arrests and a kind of crisis and bans and more arrests and increasingly loud calls for reform of the global body. And a lot of people were talking about transparency and term limits and age limits and all kinds of aspects of reform, but no one was really talking about gender balance as being one of the most significant improvements that FIFA could make. I was at that time chairing FIFA's Women's Football Task Force, and we decided that we would try and make a difference to this subject. I wrote a submission to the Reform Committee, which essentially asked for 2 things: gender balance in decision-making targeting that kind of magical tipping point of 30%, at least for a start, and fair and proportionate resourcing of women's football. Now, this is reflective of Title IX, which is regulation that applies only in the US. It's a great piece of regulation. Anyone in government, if you'd like some ideas, Title IX applies in the US education system, and it says basically that if you're an education provider and you take even $1 of federal government funding, then you must provide opportunities that are not gender discriminatory within your education institution. So this affected, you know, the law faculty, the engineering faculty, and it made a big impact in the professional disciplines. And then they got to sport and they thought, oh my God, what have we done? We're spending all this money on, you know, the baseball and NFL, and they rapidly had to rebalance their spending. That took place in the 80s in the US. So that was when the US women's team started to produce these phenomenal athletes who were coming through the college system because suddenly they were getting an equal opportunity. And as a result of that, football, or soccer as they call it, is played now in 93% of NCAA institutions in the US. I think it's the third most popular sport. It's just phenomenal, the rise of women's football in an environment where all you do is you say, you can't discriminate. You can't discriminate. That was all. It's a very simple rule, but it was like, you know, a magic potion in the impact that it had on women's sports. And this is why the Americans win so much at the Olympics. They're women athletes, not just in football, but across the board. They've won more World Cups than any other country. They've won more Olympic gold medals than any other country because they had a rule that said you can't discriminate, and they had a means to monitor and enforce it, which is another challenge. So after we wrote our reform submission and we kind of lobbed it in, we got busy on social media. We had a hashtag, Women in FIFA. FIFA fortunately put the submission on their website in 3 languages so we could spread it around the world, and it became public. I wrote an opinion piece which the New York Times published. The Reform Committee of FIFA was running around taking input, you know, talking to the public, and we did our best to make sure that they got as much input as possible from those who were advocating for gender equality. The guy who was chair of the Reform Committee would be giving, you know, public. This was during a crisis period, right? So he was the face of FIFA, saying, you know, I know it's bad, but we're fixing it. We're going to do all these reforms, and this process will become better. So wherever he was being interviewed, we sort of found out who was interviewing him at conferences or whatever, and tried to find people who knew them, and then would brief them on what questions that he should be asked. And a lot of those questions got asked. I mean, you know, we didn't control these people, but we had the power of suggestion, and most of the time we got good results. The hashtag became very popular on social media. It reached tens of millions of people, and it shaped the conversation to the point where FIFA itself kind of adopted this narrative that, you know, we used to be bad, things were very bad, but don't worry, we're reforming, and these gender equality reforms will be part of it. So they would put me in press conferences and have me briefing the media on background on what these reforms were. They completely adopted the narrative that we had written, somewhat to my surprise actually, but you know, by this time FIFA was very much being guided by their lawyers and their crisis communications consultants, and those people could clearly see the value of our proposals. So FIFA passed some reforms last year in February 2016. We didn't get everything that we asked for, of course, but we did make some significant progress. And into the FIFA Statutes now, there are some important provisions which highlight gender equality. In the statutory objectives of FIFA, so this is their whole reason to exist, that article now includes 2 additional clauses. One of them says that one of the purposes of FIFA is to promote the development of women's football and the inclusion of women at all levels of football governance. That's a statutory objective of FIFA. Another one is that it should use its best efforts to enable, to resource participation for anyone who wants to participate, regardless of gender or age, interestingly. So if you're an old woman, you know, or becoming one, it's a pretty good article for you. You know, those things weren't there before, but they now are part of the framework in which FIFA operates. There's also an article that imposes obligations on member federations and says that their legislative bodies have to have regard to the importance of gender equality in their constitution, in their makeup. So over time, you know, the days of all-male boards and bodies should come to an end as these provisions take hold. There are also regulations in FIFA's own governance regulations where a lot of clauses were inserted. So, for example, if you look at the job of the Finance Committee, one of the things it has to do is make provision, financial provision, for the development of women's football. If you look at the Development Committee, they have to have programs that provide for this. If you look at the Governance Committee's charter, it's got gender equality as one of its within its ambit. And if you look at the Audit Committee, they're supposed to audit that these things have been done. So all throughout the founding documents of FIFA, you'll see changes that improve the representation and the resourcing, including that there are 6 women now on the FIFA Executive Committee. There is 1 quota position for each confederation. I think I've got 10 minutes left. Steph's dying to give me a red card, you know. I've never had one. I'll try not to get one today. I wanted to offer a few reflections on leadership and some of the challenges that we face in the women's game, in the global context. Because you're the leaders, right? I mean, you're the leaders in Victoria and you're in this room because you have a role and a position of influence somewhere. Within your club, within your federation, within the referees, within the coaching environment. So that theme of leadership, I think, always comes back to the theme of change. We're living in an environment of perhaps seismic change in sport and in society for women. If you look back 100 years ago, you know, your grandmother probably couldn't go to university. She probably couldn't get a job, certainly not as a CEO or the Prime Minister. And a lot has changed, you know, in just the last 100 years out of the thousands of years of human history. And I now feel like there's a real acceleration in women's sport, which for so long was neglected and ignored. I mean, our sport is now, I think, bigger than netball for girls under 12, which is amazing. I mean, as a kid, all I saw was girls playing netball, and now there are more playing football than netball. Society is also changing. I mean, you can't help but have noticed the Me Too campaign, and, you know, we live in a post-Weinstein world now, apparently, I read. But, you know, what I see more broadly is that women are finding a collective voice to call out the biases they've always known are there and which have been normalised. And they're calling them out, apparently to the shock of the rest of the world. But, you know, did you not know that, you know, I don't walk down the street at night without looking over both shoulders first? Like, did you not know that? Is there any woman in this room who doesn't look both ways before walking out to the street at night? Anyone? Okay. Guys, did you know that? Did you know that your wives and your sisters and your daughters don't walk outside at night without looking over both shoulders? And they live with that every day of their lives. Okay, that's what these movements are exposing. You know, we're so normalised, you kind of don't even notice it. It's not even a big deal until you put it like that and you think, really? Half the population is looking over their shoulders because they're worried that the other half of the population is going to belt them. And that's happening in this city tonight. So they're the voices that we're hearing in broader society, and it will have an implication in sport. What I see unfolding in football is more raising of voices and calling out of these things collectively. We've seen player labour disputes, and that's almost in a category of its own, I think, because of the nature of them as labour disputes. But more broadly, you know, the Women in FIFA campaign, the election campaigns that I was involved in were campaigns where people raised their voices. You may know I lost the election campaign, which is a whole other story we don't have time for, but I can tell you that in the week I lost, the Twitter reach going into that week was 4 million. After I lost, and a lot of players and others spoke up on social media, it was 31 million just on Twitter. And I was amazed at the the global interest and willingness to pipe up on something that people felt passionately about. So I think we'll see more of that in the future. The Brazilian women, you may have read that they're former players, going back to Sissi and, you know, Formiga and others who recently resigned from the team in protest, have went public in a social media campaign asking their federation to meet with them, saying, we are distressed at what you're doing to this team. We're distressed that we spent our lives building up women's football in Brazil. We gave all our energy to this cause, and yet we play no part in the game. If you look at Christiane's resignation video, you know, she says, you call it women's football, but there's barely any women. Why can't we be involved? Why can't you answer our questions? Where's the merchandise? Why don't you have a marketing strategy for us? There are so many people who'd love to help. Why don't you let us into running our own game? And this is just in the last couple of months, in fact, since they were here in Australia playing. I think there was a lot going on under the hood that we didn't know about when they were here. And just yesterday, I was surprised to see the NWSL Media Association. So this is the American equivalent of a W League Media Association, if we had such a thing. They piped up yesterday with, I don't know, 30, 40 signatories, saying that in the US soccer presidential elections coming up, they felt that women's football was being ignored as a topic, and they called upon the candidates and the media, the mainstream media, to address this and not let this topic fall by the wayside. I mean, that was amazing that you actually have a collective voice of media organisations saying, don't forget the women, don't forget the women, right? And I've never seen that happen before, but again, it's another example of collective voicing. Another challenge, I'll mention four, but the second is club football. Club football is going to be increasingly important to the next phase of growth. There are a lot of good national teams playing. There are a lot of others who really, really struggle with their level of resourcing, and I think that the dial on that is not going to shift massively in the next 5 years, but where it will shift massively is when the big clubs start to get involved. Big and small, actually. But, you know, when you look at the fact that Manchester United still doesn't have a women's team, you've got to believe that there's a big influx of investment that will arrive over the next 5 to 10 years, and it will come through club football. Club football, after all, is where the male players make their living, and that's where most of the money is. Club football, in the aggregate, has far more cash than FIFA earns, or the national teams earn, and that will become the case for women increasingly. Now, whether clubs do it well or do it badly is really important to the development of the game. If they do it badly, it could be pretty bad. You've probably seen the same examples I have of some of the awful promotions and things where, you know, the women are not really presented as athletes at all, but they look like, I don't know, figures out of a video game or something. They don't even look like athletes. You know, that kind of presentation can be very cringeworthy and won't promote the game, I believe. But if it's done well, and there are examples of clubs who do it well, Emma mentioned Portland Thorns, there are others. I mean, in Manchester, you only have to look across the city to Man City versus Man United, and you see a world of difference there. Others that have done it well are Olympique Lyon, Chelsea and Arsenal have done it well, and plenty of others in Europe, Ajax, PSV. If it's done well, it'll make a massive difference, and that actually goes all the way down the line to the NPL clubs, to every club that plays. Look in your own club. Is it welcoming for girls? Or is it like kind of an all-boys school out of last century? I don't know. Just ask yourself that question. Is it really welcoming for girls? If you ran an all-boys school and then you suddenly introduced girls, what would change? Have you made those sorts of changes? Okay, you'd need different bathrooms. Maybe the gender balance of teachers might change. Let's see that in coaching, perhaps. What about the culture would change? What about the warm-up exercises? Do they go in and belt each other for warm-up exercises? Or is that not really what your daughter wants to do as a warm-up? You know, and you actually might find that with a cultural shift that's more inclusive, that you'll find more boys will take part in the game as well. A couple of comments there. FIFA is bringing in new club licensing requirements where there'll be increasing pressure on the top clubs in the world to have women's teams. We're seeing that start to make a difference already in South America, which is a difficult culture for women to play football sometimes. And I think we'll see that increasingly around the world. And mixed gender football, which has already been mentioned, will be a big part of it. I'm a huge fan of that. I think there's no reason why kids can't play together. And the best players of my era in the Matildas came through mixed gender football because they had the opportunity to play at the level that would challenge them and which was appropriate for their age, for their ability and for their ambition. And that's true for boys as well. Third point, women coaches. We've talked a little about that already, but you know, there are a lot of difficult stereotypes that women have to overcome to be coaches. You might have heard the saying that men take charge and women take care. Have you heard that? Men take charge, women take care, right? That's the legacy that we all live with. When you're a coach, you take charge, right? If you close your eyes and imagine a coach, they're probably shouting and pointing. They're probably male, right? So try and adjust yourself to the idea that coaches might look different to that. We talk about merit. People say, oh, it's all very well to have women coaches, but, you know, they have to be good enough, right? Have you heard that? It's a bit like the ones in the boardroom. They have to be good enough. Well, I would challenge you to test your definition of merit. If your definition of merit is someone who's kind of very strong and shouts a lot and borders on a bully, and you wonder, then you think, well, women don't really stack up very well in my definition of merit, then I'd suggest you've got the wrong definition of merit. And I mean, this debate goes through the corporate world as well. Let's not ask ourselves what's wrong with the women that they can't succeed in this system, and start asking ourselves what's wrong with the system that only half the people can find their way through it into positions of authority. Probably the women aren't busting your door down if you're at a club and they're not demanding that coaching job, because, you know, they're probably busy working harder to compensate for the gender pay gap, and they're probably still doing most of the household chores, as all of the statistics would tell us. So they're not there with like 3 nights free a week busting down your door. So you should go looking for them. You will find them there. And I would urge you to find those who are senior. Don't kind of find the one who's just hung up her boots and who's going to be your project to turn her into the next Matildas coach. It's not a one-person strategy, right? It's about opening the doors and finding those who have experience and have capability. I can see some in the room, actually, people I played with all those years ago who are coaching. I'll give you a clue, they've probably got some grey hair, like I have. But, you know, they have years of experience and you can tap into that. Sun Wen is coaching as the assistant coach of China, you may know. And I think you might know she's coming here tomorrow to talk to you as well. She was the FIFA Player of the Century for last century, so you're going to meet someone special tomorrow. The fourth thing I would mention is ethnic diversity and women of colour. This is a huge raging debate in the US and around the world, and I won't say a lot more other than ask yourself the question, have we got real ethnic diversity here in Australia as well? Cast your mind back to the Asian Cup and the mixes of the crowds that we saw. Do you see any reflection of that in your club? If you don't, is that an untapped opportunity for you? So just in closing, because I'm about to get a red card, if you're a leader, you're a change agent and you're an advocate. And you'll have the opportunity to ask the question of those in power, what's the proportion of your resourcing that goes to male and female football, whether you're a government department or a council or a sponsor? Those are good questions for everyone in the ecosystem of football to reflect upon. If you are a leader and you have decision-making power, embrace those questions. They're good questions to be asked. They're not threatening questions, because actually if you're in a position of decision-making authority, you know that every time you do something for gender equality, you burn up political capital. Right? There's a bunch of people who are going to roll their eyes at you and say, oh, okay, and you're going to have to convince them. So you're going to have to burn up capital. Those on the outside who are asking the questions are your allies. They are the ones who make it easier for you to work from the inside. So whether you're on the inside of decision making or you feel you're on the outside, I would say embrace those questions and enable the stakeholders in our game to take the biggest takeable step towards change. And I say that because you can always criticise that, we didn't do more, we should have, but I would say if you're advocating for change, find the biggest takeable step and then urge those stakeholders to take it as soon as possible. It's a world game. Our opposition is out there. It's all around the world. Our opposition is not each other. It's kind of easy to, when you're on an island that's a long way from anywhere, to see our differences and what divides us and forget about what unites us. So I would urge you to zoom out a little and see that the Australian game is something that we're all part of. We're all building the mosaic that is Australian football. And on nights like tonight, when we see the Matildas take that to the world, we should all feel proud about being part of it. And I think women's football is one thing that has got hugely rapid prospects of growth in front of it, and I'd invite you all to be part of making that happen. Thank you.